This is Norman Robinson, a former New Orleans reporter and news manager, and the person that may have single-handedly turned the tide in the 1991 Louisiana governor's race that almost resulted in the state being run by a Nazi. This is Muhammad X, the author of African Addo, a street-fighting manual for militant blacks against whites. This is also Dorothy Vanderbilt, the author of Finders Keepers, a how-to book for women that's basically softcore porn. Most importantly, this is David Duke, the notorious former House Representative of Louisiana, mostly known for being the Grand Wizard of the KKK back in the 1970s, turned professional far-right politician in the 1980s. This specific event was the runoff debate on November 6, 1991, 10 days before the election between Duke, who shockingly edged out incumbent Governor Buddy Roemer in the primary, to face off against once three-time Governor Edwin Edwards, the Cajun Prince himself, known for being as corrupt as he was smooth. As Edwards once said, "The only thing David Duke and myself have in common is that we're both wizards in the sheets." Damn, that's pretty good. Louisiana is famous for its crooked politicians, and Edwin Edwards stemmed from a long line of Democrats molded in the vein of Governor, borderline Emperor Huey P. Long and his many political descendants. But adding a Nazi former KKK member to the mix was a whole new batch of insane, even by Louisiana's political standards. This runoff debate is significant for one reason. It was the turning point for the Duke campaign, because despite his disturbing past, leading into this, Duke was trending towards a surprise victory. That is until our dude Norman, with some help from people behind the scenes, was able to expose a weakness in Duke. But how the hell did we even get here? To this time and place where it was of paramount importance that a famously crooked politician be the only hope against a Hitler-loving former KKK member. It's easy to look at Louisiana, where I am originally from, being in the deep south and this being some 30 plus years ago, to say, yeah, racism was probably as casual as Garfield eating a lasagna on a shitty Monday. But despite all this, most Americans strongly disfavor Nazism. This is a very important point I want to make. It seems a no-brainer to not let a former Grand Wizard of the KKK and a man that would throw parties on Hitler's birthday get anywhere near the top seat of Louisiana. Racism and Nazism is obviously bad, but it's often a subject that can be nuanced and twisted, that even something as blatant as being involved with the Klan can be overlooked if you can expertly deflect and simultaneously present the right arguments. Likewise, it goes to show the power of populist weaponization against opponents, especially when times are tough economically, and in the case of this debate, its overall weakness as well. But first, we need to dive briefly into Duke's past to see how he built a strong campaign up to this very moment, and how this debate was the beginning of the end for Duke's winning chances. David Duke got his start yapping about his racist bullshit at my alma mater, LSU, in Free Speech Alley. But unlike Steven Crowder or any modern-day far-right fanatic, Duke was soft-spoken, well-tempered, and nicely put together. Basically, the lack of aggression made it easier for him to play victim when others aggressively disagreed with his pro-white supremacy rhetoric disguised as a "let's consider all sides" arguments. It's clear by a statement made in 1970 that Duke always had his eye on running for office. Politics is simply a struggle for power. Power will be in the hands of people who support white interests or in the hands of those who serve non-white interests. He catapulted his love for hogging the controversial spotlight into a position as National Information Director of the Ku Klux Klan, later becoming the youngest Grand Wizard ever and taking the Klan from a bunch of backwood turds and bedroom sheets to a reputable three-piece suit organization. But let me be clear, you can be a six-piece suit Klan and you're still the fucking Klan. You guys suck. After many failed attempts to raise his profile in the 1970s, Duke would eventually leave the Klan, and he entered the 80s lost on his next approach. He meandered about, converting his basement into a bookstore, founding Americana Books, and began selling the previously mentioned titles, among other classics like Mein Kampf, The Myth of the 6 Million, and everyone's favorite, Hitler Was My Friend. He also dipped his toes into the non-profit world, founding the NAAWP. But Duke's internal fire was truly reignited in 1987 following an invitation to speak at the Keep Forsyth White movement in Forsyth, Georgia, that opposed black migration into the town. Duke referred to the event as the beginning of the white civil rights movement. This catapulted Duke into several national speaking events and pushed him to try to make a run at the presidency as a Democrat in 1988 after Jesse Jackson's announcement to do the same. When they basically wouldn't let him through the convention doors, he turned his eyes back home to Louisiana. Specifically in Louisiana's 81st district in Metairie near New Orleans, where Duke resided, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. The murder rate in New Orleans was higher than ever, creating white flight to his district, and fears about imaginary black on white violence increased. When an opening for representative came open in the 81st in 1989, Duke switched parties and took his chances against Republican John Treen, a man that just couldn't seem to get it up to campaign, knock on a few doors, or make any efforts outside of the country club. Duke proved an effective grassroots populist, creating a frenzy with his facially reconstructed good looks because, you know, the Aryan race and all that jazz, his mild-mannered and timid charm, and regular rallying for cutting taxes, being tough on crime, reforming welfare, and getting rid of affirmative action. He renounced his ties to the Klan. Those supporters often were caught whispering or chanting out pro-racist sentiments at his rallies because racist sentiment can be silent and unspoken, but awareness of its presence still empowers those who aren't shy about being proactively racist. The frenzy around Duke was too much for a lackadaisical Treen to overcome, and Duke would end up winning the seat. Meanwhile, Beth Rickey of the Republican State Central Committee watched on in horror. Treen had hired Rickey, a Reagan diehard, to dig up dirt on Duke during the campaign, and as we've already discussed, there was plenty of dirt to find. Rickey would later go on to urge the state GOP to do something about Duke, but essentially they thought him to just be a fringe candidate that would eventually disappear. Rickey took matters into her own hands and co-founded the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism that collected a massive portfolio on all of Duke's past ongoings, which would later be cited and used by Norman Robinson in the runoff debate. After a failed Senate run in 1990, Duke took this momentum and entered the governor's race in 1991 and a rabid fan base behind him, one that was sick of the status quo and the failing Louisiana economy. Primarily, the oil industry had taken a massive hit in the 80s, and Louisiana and wages were suffering as a result. Meanwhile, Democrat Edwin Edwards, who had grown unpopular after serving as governor for 12 years already, decided to return to run for office after a 4-year absence, widely assuming he'd be facing off against Buddy Roemer in the finals. But Roemer was also pulling a John Treen of sorts, not putting in nearly enough effort against Duke, whose profile was soaring, especially in North Louisiana, where Roemer hardly visited during the campaign. Duke was also making national TV appearances on shows like The Morton Downey Jr. Show and Phil Donahue, reeling in donations and contributions from all over the country. Beth Rickey and her coalition were doing all they could to bury Duke leading into the primary, including providing New Orleans TV with an entire 1986 recording of a conversation between Duke and a very public neo-Nazi, where the two made disparaging comments about Jews, because that's what Nazis do. But the effort was made too late in a world where information traveled much slower and minds had already been made up. Ultimately, Roemer's apathy cost him, and Duke squeezed him out in the primary, with Edwards winning 33%, Duke 31%, and Roemer 26% of the vote. The stage was set for a runoff between Edwards, who was waning with white voters and was struggling to raise funds and light a fire under his campaign, and Duke, who was surging. Which brings us to the debate and the moment of truth. Now, not only do we need to analyze Norman's approach on Duke, but also Duke's performance overall in the debate. You see, up to this point, Duke relied heavily on audience supporters to bolster his attacks against his opponents. With this being a closed debate though, with only a moderator and 4 panelists, this strategy became non-existent and would work more in favor for the fact-spitting Edwards. Norman's first question was to name the 3 most important bills in your legislative package. Edwards answered it straight: tax, education, and environmental reform. Duke's answer was more a criticism of Edwards' plan. It's at this point he starts to complain that the time allotted, which was 1.5 minutes, wasn't enough, even though it was the same amount that Edwards got. This is when Norman first chimes into the moderator and says Duke isn't answering the question, to which Duke responds,
"What you oppose as governor is just as important as what you propose."
Yeah, David, it is, but you spend most of your time only talking about what you oppose, though. What kind of effective policy can you put in place when you're literally just crying about the other guy the whole time? The other guy won't be there if you win. You can't just have concepts of a plan. Then he goes on to chirp at Norman.
He's breaking the rules. I don't hear you
We
objecting.
are going to go one at a time.
Somebody's dialing up the whiny little victim playing bitch, and it's you, David. Later, another panelist, Jeff Dewey, asked for a list of executives each candidate knows that they could work with to bring new industry to Louisiana. Again, Edwards answers the question pretty straight with a list of names. Duke mentions a California publishing agency, but then he starts to swipe at the question because clearly he doesn't really have a list. He comments with this.
I don't know if the question is that relevant.
Things get more intense when Norman, keeping the playing field level, rightly goes after Edwards on whether he supported prohibiting any elected officials from doing private businesses with the state, obviously a dig at Edwards' past. And of course, Duke saw a crack in the window to pounce hard, calling out Edwards, claiming he had a list of names from which his friends had benefited, to which Edwards calls his bluff and tells him to name them on the spot.
Appointments, and we have the names if you want them. Who said that? Well, you know, who specifically...
Here and now, name them.
I'll get those for you right now. Get them for me, would you, Jim?
Dewey goes on to question Duke on his past jobs that qualifies him to run a $9 billion business like the state of Louisiana. Duke mentions the translator job he got from his dad in Laos during the Vietnam War, then mentions a computer consulting firm among many other small businesses, before Dewey pressures him to name the nonprofit organization he ran, and he says it on air.
What nonprofit organization?
The AAWP.
All right.
Edwards then points out that he had run 8 campaigns in the past decade or so and had only managed to win 1. It's clear that Duke was starting to get shaky at this point. Then the big bomb came. Norman had been warming up for this one, and he didn't hold back.
Mr. Duke, I have to tell you, I am a very concerned citizen. I am a journalist, but first and foremost, I am a concerned citizen. And as a minority who has heard you say some very excoriating and diabolical things about minorities, about blacks, about Jews, about Hispanics, I am scared, sir. I've heard you say that Jews deserve to be in the ash bin of history. I've heard you say that horses contributed more to the building of America than blacks did. Given that kind of past, sir, and given that kind of diabolical, evil, vile mentality,
Mr. Robinson,
convince me,
your
sir.
question.
Convince me, sir, and other minorities like me, why they should entrust their lives and the lives of their children to you.
Not only is this moment powerful because it puts Duke in an uncomfortable position to answer for his racist past, but it also turns the table on Duke's go-to strategy. In the presence of another man expressing vulnerable fear, Duke struggles to position himself as the victim. Norman's cool, professional, and collected delivery is too honest and sincere for the wily Duke to scramble out of. Instead, he tries to play it off as, "We've all been racist at one point in our lives. Edwards is racist, he's using green power to get black power." It's at this moment that you see Duke for what he really is. A one-trick, smooth-talking charlatan with a damning past and a man massively unqualified to be governor. Duke and Norman would go back and forth more later in the debate, with the former telling the latter he was taking cheap shots, to which Norman only responds,
That's a cheap shot on your part.
It's your
And
record,
I don't
sir.
appreciate it.
and the record is plenty to speak for itself. Clearly by his behavior at the end, Duke was impatient to get the fuck out of there. But even though Edwards cooked him in a setting in which Duke couldn't release his sycophants on his opponent with jeers and rejection, it wasn't all damning for the former Grand Wizard. Sadly, in fact, many complaints came in criticizing Norman Robinson for being unfair and unprofessional in his attacks on Duke. Believe it or not, people still bought Duke's victim tactic yet again. CNN even commented that Norman had personally just elected Duke as governor. Norman later stated that he started carrying a pistol out of fear of retaliation from Duke's supporters. But the damage done here opened the floodgates to even more national interest. And a follow-up on Meet the Press with Tim Russert between the candidates only further brought attention to Duke's heinous past and lack of knowledge about Louisiana industry and any potential policy plans when he asked both candidates to name the 3 biggest industries in Louisiana. Of course, Duke didn't know, and Edwards answered with ease. Suddenly, a lot of money started coming in nationwide for both Edwin Edwards and the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. This is when when the famous "Vote for the Crook, it's important" slogan took off. Even further damning for Duke was when he lied about his religious affiliation, as if that's the obvious thing to tip people over the edge to go against Duke. But yeah, welcome to the South, I guess. In the end, Edwards would win 61% to Duke's 39%, with Edwards taking the majority of the southern parishes, while Duke took a good chunk of the north. But the most disparaging statistic is still glaring to this day. Duke took 55% of the white vote, indicating just how much of an impact he had despite losing. Duke would make one last gasp effort at the presidency in 1992, but he didn't even register on the radar. While he seemingly faded into political oblivion, he was quoted saying during this campaign, "My politics are coming in America." And sure enough, David Duke's gubernatorial run did become something of a godfather moment for far-right politics in America. In the very same presidential race, Pat Buchanan was able to take Duke's gubernatorial platform as a pro-nationalist, anti-globalist candidate and achieve some minimal success, giving this sort of candidate that would only grow further right and extreme as the years went on, a permanent place in American politics. Duke would come out from whatever filthy couch he was hiding under after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, essentially taking Duke's platform mainstream, with David massively supporting Trump and also making an appearance at the Charlottesville incident in 2017. He even took another stab at Louisiana office around this time and was again able to garner a disturbing amount of votes. David Duke's emergence is often told retrospectively as something of a satirical event. Like, whoa, you guys ran a crook versus a Nazi? That's so wacky in Louisiana. Despite his record that wasn't decades and decades old, but as late as 2 years prior to 1991, Duke was able to make it to the final stage to be Louisiana's top dog. Whether white voters did feel as if they were threatened by minorities committing crimes upon them, stealing their well-earned tax money, snatching away their jobs, or even if it was the more rational option of wanting less big government, it's hard to say which argument did the most to win voters over to Duke. But while voting for the crook may have been important, it goes to show the dangers of underestimating a candidate that's willing to use anything and everything to win. As common sense of a choice it seems to not vote for a fascist-like government, all it takes is a little bit of good timing, pointing at the right things gone wrong, and some fear-mongering on the perception of things being taken away or put at risk, and boom, you got a candidate that can compete. You may or may not agree with me on this. Like how Edwin Edwards' corrupt politics were born from what Huey P. Long's politics established, Trumpian politics are David Duke's politics. Not because he's as savagely and comically guilty as Duke is wearing a bedsheet, but because Duke's strategy was to play on people's greatest fears, tear down his opponent, and to self-victimize in place of proposing any actual policy. Well, that works on voters. And it's important to look back at this moment in history to remind ourselves to always carefully ask, as Norman Robinson did, who and what are we voting for? And do they qualify to truly represent us as Americans? But it's not all rainy days and gloom for the history of David Duke. No, in a fine irony, Duke's part in the 1991's governor race landed him a spot in a major part of black music and cultural history. That's right, in 1991, New Orleans-based MC Tucker and DJ Irv dropped the first ever bounce song, Where They At, which featured the classic forever etched in stone line, "Fuck David Duke, fuck David Duke."